Imagine you're sitting on the top floor of the Glen Park Public Library in San Francisco. The place is eerily quiet, interrupted only by the sound of turning pages. Next to you is a 29-year-old man wearing an ordinary shirt, looking like a graduate student searching for sources for a thesis. But what you don't know is that this young man, at this very moment, is managing a transcontinental commercial empire from behind his laptop screen, an empire that sells everything forbidden, from pure cocaine to hacking software and even murder-for-hire contracts. Suddenly, a man and a woman in plain clothes burst into the room, starting a loud, staged argument right behind the young man. As he turns in shock to see what's happening, a third agent reaches out with lightning speed and snatches his laptop while it is still open. In that split second, the mask fell off Dread Pirate Roberts, the digital godfather who had baffled the FBI for years. Ross Ulbricht fell, not as a revolutionary hero, but as an emperor whose kingdom collapsed entirely because of a moment of human curiosity.
This is not just a story about drug trafficking. It is a story about how extreme idealism can turn into a predatory beast that demands blood through screens. It is the story of the conflict between absolute freedom and total chaos. How did a physics genius turn into a criminal ordering 6 cold-blooded assassinations? And was the Silk Road a noble social experiment, or the largest poison factory in human history? If you are passionate about lifting the veil on the dark side of history, and if you have the courage to face the terrifying truths that governments hide behind walls of encryption, you are in the right place. Join our army of investigators around the world by clicking the subscribe button and activating the bell. We don't just tell stories, we reconstruct the crime scene. Fasten your seatbelts, for the Silk Road file is now open.
Our story begins in Austin, Texas at the turn of the new millennium. Ross Ulbricht did not possess horns or claws. Instead, he possessed a string of pearls called sharp intelligence. Ross was born into a traditional Texan family, a family that believed in hard work and success. Ross was a quiet child, a nature lover, spending hours observing insects and plants as if trying to understand the source code that moves this universe. His academic excellence was extraordinary. He received a full scholarship to study materials science and physics at the University of Pennsylvania. There, in the cold university labs, Ross dealt with atoms and molecules, but his mind was swimming in an entirely different space, the space of philosophy and politics. That period was witnessing intellectual ferment in America. Wars in the Middle East, financial crises, and a growing sense among the youth that the state was merely a massive machine for crushing individuals. Ross absorbed the ideas of the Austrian school of economics and read Ludwig von Mises and Murray Rothbard. He became obsessed with the idea of libertarianism. He believed that any government intervention in an individual's life was a form of modern slavery. For Ross, the war on drugs led by America was the biggest lie in history. He didn't see it as protecting society, but as an assault on the individual's right to choose what enters their body.
Here, the demonic seed began to sprout in his mind. He wondered, why isn't there a place in this world, real or virtual, where humans can exchange goods and services with complete freedom without the state putting its hand in their pockets or putting handcuffs on their wrists? Ross didn't want money at that stage, he wanted revolution. He saw himself as the Robin Hood of the digital age. He returned to Austin after graduation and tried to engage in legitimate business. He opened an online used bookstore, but the work was slow and boring for a mind that wanted to change the world.
In those long nights where the blue screen light was his only companion, Ross began writing in his personal diary words that served as a manifesto for his coming kingdom. He wrote about the idea of creating an indestructible market, a market that relied on encryption as a shield and programming as a sword. To him, the site wasn't just a store, it was an economic experiment to prove that humans could organize themselves without the need for police or taxes. He initially called the project Underground Broker, but soon settled on the name Silk Road. The name carried deep historical symbolism. The ancient road was not just a corridor for goods, but a bridge for the exchange of ideas, cultures, and religions between East and West, transcending the borders of great empires.
But to build this road, he had to face a dark reality. His first experiment in this world was not software-based, but agricultural. In the basement of his house, Ross began growing magic mushrooms. He wanted to be the first seller on his own site to test the system. He spent hours caring for those fungi, watching them grow under artificial lights, as if he were raising children who would change the face of history. He felt a kind of moral euphoria. He thought that by selling these materials, he was liberating people's minds. Ross didn't realize then that those small mushrooms were the first step on a steep slope that would eventually lead him to order human heads in cold blood. Ross built the site using complex programming languages and integrated it with encryption technologies that were still in their infancy. He worked alone, in complete isolation, even from his closest friends and girlfriend. He lived a double life. By day, he was the nice young man who practiced yoga and loved outdoor trips, and by night, he was the engineer building the Amazon of crime. He felt the burden of secrecy and began recording in his diary his fears of being discovered, but his inflated ego always convinced him that he was smarter than the entire system.
In January 2011, Ross pressed the Enter button to announce the launch of the Silk Road to the world. There were no advertisements, just mysterious posts in dark web forums. Ross waited with a beating heart. Would anyone come? Would his economic theory succeed? A few days later, the first order arrived. Someone, somewhere in the world, bought magic mushrooms from Ross and paid for them in Bitcoin. At that moment, Ross felt he had become a god in his own universe. He had broken the state's monopoly on violence and trade. But what idealist Ross Ulbricht didn't realize was that the road he was paving with freedom would soon be filled with bodies, addicts, and blackmailers, and that the mask he would later wear, Dread Pirate Roberts, would devour his true face forever, transforming him from a dreaming physicist into the most formidable mafia the cyber world had ever known. While the world in 2011 was celebrating people's revolutions in public squares, a revolution of a different kind was being plotted in absolute silence inside a modest apartment in San Francisco. It wasn't a revolution of slogans, but a revolution of algorithms. Ross Ulbricht realized that his idea for creating the Silk Road would remain an industrial dream unless he found a way to break the first rule in the world of the Internet. Every movement leaves a trace. He was looking for absolute invisibility, not just for himself, but for every seller and buyer who would set foot in his digital kingdom. Here began the stage of the sacred engineering of darkness, where Ross integrated two technologies that changed the face of human history forever, turning them into a black hole that swallowed all government tracking attempts.
The first ingredient in this demonic recipe was the Tor browser, Tor, the onion router. The shocking historical irony that many may not know is that this technology, which Ross used to demolish the pillars of the state, was originally a government invention par excellence. It was developed by the U.S. Naval Research Laboratory to protect the communications of spies and informants abroad.
The idea of Tor was based on the principle of onion layers. Instead of your data moving directly from your computer to the site you are visiting, it passes through a series of random nodes or servers around the world. At each stop, the data is encrypted with a new layer so that Station A only knows where the data came from and Station B only knows where it is going, without any of them having the full picture.
For Ross, Tor was the invisibility cloak he had always dreamed of. He spent long nights studying the source code of this technology and how to set up hidden servers, hidden services ending with the .onion domain. These sites cannot be accessed via Google or regular browsers. They exist in the dark web, a virtual space that has no presence in traditional address records. Ross felt a surge of euphoria as he saw the Silk Road site working for the first time behind these encrypted walls. He knew that the FBI, with all its capabilities, would search for the site's IP address and find nothing but a digital mirage moving between thousands of computers around the world in fractions of a second. But spatial invisibility was not enough. What is the use of hiding your location if money will reveal your identity? Here, Ross faced the biggest dilemma. How can commercial transactions involving millions of dollars be conducted without using banks, credit cards, or PayPal? He needed digital blood to feed the veins of his empire, an anonymous, decentralized currency that leaves no paper trail. At that critical moment in history, Bitcoin appeared. Bitcoin in 2011 was still a crawling infant. Only a few tech geeks knew its value. But Ross Ulbricht, with his physical and economic mind, saw it as the digital messiah that would liberate trade. Bitcoin was not just a currency, it was a system based on the blockchain, a public ledger that records transactions without names, but via wallet addresses consisting of random strings of numbers and letters. Ross realized that the marriage between Tor and Bitcoin was the magic formula. Tor hides where you are, and Bitcoin hides who you are. Ross did not stop at merely accepting Bitcoin as a means of payment. He created a currency tumbler system within the site. When a buyer sends money to a seller, the money does not go directly. Instead, it enters a tumbler that breaks it into thousands of small pieces, mixes it with other users' money, and then reassembles it and sends it to its final destination. This system made it mathematically impossible for financial analysts in the government to track the path of the money. Ross would sit in public cafes, sipping his coffee coldly, watching through his screen the flow of millions of dollars of cocaine, weapons, and poisons, knowing that all this financial movement was completely invisible to the global financial system. To complete the fortress of darkness, Ross imposed a strict system for communication within the site using PGP, Pretty Good Privacy encryption. He required sellers and buyers not to send their home addresses or transaction details except through messages encrypted with private keys owned only by the two parties. Even he himself, as the site manager, was unable to read those messages. He felt the pride of the genius who designed a labyrinth that even its creator could not reveal its secrets if forced to do so. In Ross's eyes, the site turned into a cathedral of encryption. He spent hours writing philosophical articles on the site's forum, explaining to users that encryption is not just a technical tool, but a political act and a sacred human right. He saw in programming codes a weapon more powerful than bullets. He wrote in one of his diaries, "We are building a new world, a world where power is for the mind, not the weapon, where privacy is the rule, not the exception." But behind this technical brilliance, terrifying aspects began to appear. The ease that Silk Road provided for access to drugs, protected by this shield of encryption, led to an explosion in the volume of operations. The site began to turn from a simple store into an industrial machine for death. Sellers of heroin and fentanyl began competing to offer the best deals, relying on the rating system, reviews, that Ross intelligently designed to mimic the Amazon site. Users would write, "This heroin is very pure, thank you Silk Road," while Ross was earning a commission from every gram sold and from every life destroyed. Ross became obsessed with security to the point of paranoia. He began to feel that everyone passing him on the street might be a federal agent. He carried his laptop with him everywhere, encrypted with complex passwords, and programmed to wipe all its data if a certain code was not entered every period of time. He lived in the encryption prison he built for himself. The sacred engineering of darkness he designed to protect people's freedom became the jailer encircling his neck. He thought the technology would compensate him for his need to trust humans, but he would later discover that the smallest hole in the wall of encryption was not technical, but purely human, and that the thread that would tie his neck to the gallows was not a programming code, but an old email he forgot in the height of megalomania. At that stage, Ross Ulbricht had completed the construction of the black hole. The world saw the calm surface of the internet, while he was diving into the depths, managing a shadow economy that was not subject to the gravity of laws. He felt he was the only captain in a raging sea, convinced that his ship was unsinkable. But what he didn't count on was that the darkness he masterfully engineered would attract types of people he never imagined existed: killers, blackmailers, and corrupt agents who would force him to abandon the sanctity of encryption to resort to the sanctity of the bullet.
By 2012, Silk Road was no longer just a technical experiment in a dark basement. It had turned into a cultural and economic phenomenon that shook the foundations of global intelligence agencies. In the heart of this storm, Ross Ulbricht was undergoing a stunning psychological metamorphosis. The shy young man who loved yoga and physics no longer felt satisfied with being just a hidden programmer. He needed an identity that matched the scale of the power he now possessed. Here, Ross decided to wear the mask of Dread Pirate Roberts, DPR, a pseudonym inspired by the novel and film The Princess Bride. This move was a stroke of genius psychologically and strategically. In the story, Dread Pirate Roberts is not one person, but a title that passes from one captain to another, ensuring the immortality of the legend even if the title holder falls. With this name, Ross sent an encrypted message to the FBI. "Even if you catch me, the pirate will remain alive, the name will be inherited by others, and the Silk Road will never die." Under this black mask, Ross Ulbricht began playing a role that no criminal in history had ever played. He became the intellectual leader of an army of outlaws. DPR was not just a drug dealer, he was a revolutionary philosopher. He created a special forum within the site, the Silk Road Forum, and began writing long, eloquent articles filled with philosophical quotes justifying the existence of the empire. He addressed thousands of users as if he were the savior who came to free them from the slavery of states and taxes. He founded what looked like an intellectual club, the Silk Road Book Club, where he discussed classical economics books and absolute freedom theories with heroin dealers and hitmen. The scene was surreal, the digital crime emperor teaching his followers how to be free while providing them with the materials that enslave them as addicts.
Here, megalomania began to seep into Ross's veins. He saw himself as a king in his virtual universe, a programming god who could not be tracked. His personal diaries at that time revealed a horrific internal struggle. While he lived in the real world in a modest rented room in San Francisco under the pseudonym Josh, sharing a kitchen with roommates who knew nothing about him, in the digital world he possessed the keys to legendary wealth. Bitcoin commissions were accumulating in his digital wallet at astronomical rates. $20 million, $50 million, reaching figures exceeding $80 million per month. He would sit in public Starbucks cafes, wearing ragged clothes, while moving under his fingers sums sufficient to buy entire cities. This stark contradiction between poor Ross and billionaire DPR created a gap in his personality. He began to trust his algorithms more than he trusted humans, and began to feel that normal human laws did not apply to the captain. Management of the Silk Road was not limited to programming only, but turned into managing a criminal enterprise with the flavor of Silicon Valley companies. Ross hired employees to help him manage the site, using pseudonyms like Inigo, Libertas, and SSBD. They had a salary scale in Bitcoin, annual leaves, and Ross even wrote an employee handbook for them, outlining the work ethics within Silk Road. He demanded integrity and justice from them in settling disputes between sellers and buyers, as if he were managing a Sharia court inside a forest of poisons. Ross sincerely believed he was building a utopia, but he didn't realize that his virtuous city was built on the skulls of overdose victims and the groans of families destroyed by the poisons passing through his site.
The hidden secrets of this period lay in the databases that Ross kept with extreme obsession. He recorded every conversation, every transaction, and every small detail. He thought that this obsession with documentation was his means of control, but in reality, he was building the guillotine that would execute him later. DPR became increasingly fierce with every attempt to threaten his kingdom. When hackers began attacking the site, DDoS attacks, to blackmail him, Ross was no longer that calm physicist. He became a general in a cyber war. He would spend days without sleep, fighting behind his screen to repel attacks, drinking enormous amounts of coffee, his bloodshot eyes never leaving the code bar. In those moments, idealism fell completely. It was no longer about freedom. It became about survival and maintaining the digital throne no matter the cost. The relationship of DPR with his community was a cult relationship. Users nicknamed him the hero and the fighter. It even reached the point where some of them tattooed their bodies with the Silk Road logo. This digital deification fed Ross's feeling that he was above accountability. He began speaking in the sovereign language of we. We are changing the face of trade. We are demolishing the idols of the state. At the same time, he was developing technical systems that grew more complex day by day to hide wealth. He created the cold wallet system and distributed his Bitcoin wealth across hundreds of encrypted wallets, believing that in this way he would make it impossible for any entity in the world to confiscate his money.
But the terrifying face of truth was appearing in private chat rooms. There, Dread Pirate Roberts was looking for absolute loyalty. He began asking his employees to provide him with photos of their real identities as a guarantee of loyalty. The same method followed by traditional mafia gangs, but in a digital way. He knew that any leak of his identity meant the end, so paranoia was his primary driver. He changed his location constantly, used public Wi-Fi networks, used double VPN technologies, and even wiped his fingerprints from his laptop keyboard every night. Ross Ulbricht had become a prisoner inside the black mask he created. He no longer dared to contact his parents or girlfriend except in the narrowest limits and with extreme caution. At the height of his rise in 2012, Silk Road was processing deals covering more than 300 types of drugs, alongside forged documents, malware, and money laundering services. The state was not oblivious. Rather, the shock in Washington was that this pirate always seemed one step ahead of them. Ross monitored police movements through informants he hired on the site and began to feel the thrill of victory. He wrote in his diary,
They are floundering in the dark, and we are here possessing the light. But what DPR didn't know was that the light he saw was not the light of freedom, but the light of investigation spotlights that were slowly crossing their threads around his neck, and that the captain who thought he was leading his ship to safety was actually heading at lightning speed towards the blood waterfall, where programming words would turn into assassination orders, and where the mask would fall to reveal a monster Ross himself never imagined existed in his mirror.
The era of the idealist trader ended, and the era of the bloody godfather began. Silk Road was no longer a corridor of trade. It became the road of hell. And Ross Ulbricht, who wanted to be Robin Hood, found himself wearing the mantle of a digital Al Capone, ready to sacrifice anyone and everything to remain the dread pirate master of the dark web. In mid-2013, while Bitcoin money was accumulating in Ross Ulbricht's accounts like mountains of digital gold, the encrypted walls he built around himself began to close in on him. The threat this time was not coming from the FBI or Interpol, but from within his kingdom itself. Here, in this paragraph, we will dive into the dark side of the moon, where the mask fell off Ross Ulbricht completely, revealing a face no one had seen before, the face of the Godfather, who sees in humans merely numbers that can be deleted with the press of a delete button.
The story began with a simple blackmail, but it was like an earthquake to the throne of dread pirate Roberts. A user named Friendly Kemi contacted Ross, claiming to possess a massive list containing the real names and addresses of thousands of sellers and buyers on Silk Road. The threat was clear and devastating. Pay me $500,000 or I will publish this list to the police and the public. For Ross, this was not just financial blackmail, it was a threat to his entire philosophy. If identities were revealed, the Silk Road would collapse, he would go to prison for life, and most importantly, the state would prove that encryption had failed to protect individuals. Here, the horrific transformation occurred. Ross Ulbricht, the young man who rejected violence and called for peace and freedom, did not hesitate for a moment. In his dark room, under the bright light of his screen, he contacted another user named Red and White, the person believed to be a prominent member of the Hells Angels gang. Ross didn't ask for his opinion, he asked him for the price. In the encrypted chats revealed by later investigations, we see a coldness that sends shivers down the spine. Ross wrote to Red and White, "This person, Friendly Kemi, represents a great danger to my project. I want a permanent solution. Can you eliminate him, and what is the price?"
Red and White's answer was purely commercial. Assassination costs between $150,000 to $300,000 depending on the difficulty. Without blinking an eye, Ross agreed. He paid $150,000 in Bitcoin for the head of Friendly Kemi. There was no screaming, there was no weapon in his hand, only clicks on the keyboard. At that moment, Silk Road turned from a drug market into a murder agency. Ross justified this act to himself with the logic of utilitarianism. He told himself, "I am killing one person to save thousands of innocent people from prison." He appointed himself judge and executioner in a world only he ruled. But diving into the swamp of blood does not end with one body. After a short period, Red and White contacted Ross again, informing him that Friendly Kemi lived with a partner and that this partner also knew a lot. With the coldness of a Roman emperor deciding the fate of slaves, Ross gave permission to kill the partner too. Then the matter was repeated with a former employee of his named Curtis Green, who was known by the nickname Flush, whom Ross thought stole money and leaked information to the police. Ross paid $80,000 to kill him.
In total, documents indicate that Ross Ulbricht issued orders to assassinate 6 people in cold blood and paid huge sums of his digital wealth for it. The hidden secrets in these conversations reveal Ross's psyche, which had completely eroded. In one message, Ross asked the hitman to send him a photo of the body after execution, with a password written on a paper next to it to confirm the death. When the killer sent him a photo, it later turned out to be faked, Ross wrote a terrifying reply. "I received the photo. Thank you. I feel relieved now because the problem is solved." The words carried no regret. Instead, they carried administrative relief, as if he had closed a file for a technical problem on his site. But the real tragedy and bitter irony in this story is that genius Ross was the victim of the biggest scam of his life. These hitmen, Red and White and others, were nothing but professional scammers, or in some cases, undercover secret agents. No real murder was executed. The photos Ross received were photos of actors or old bodies that had been manipulated. Ross Ulbricht, who thought he controlled the threads of the world, was distributing millions of dollars in Bitcoin to digital ghosts laughing at him on the other side of the screen. But legally and morally, the intent was complete. He paid the money, gave the order, and waited for death with joy.
Here, a terrifying question arises. How can someone who loves physics, music, and yoga turn into this entity? Psychologists who studied his file describe the condition as digital dissociation. When you kill through a screen, you don't smell the gunpowder, you don't see the look of terror in the victim's eye, and you don't hear the family's screams. Death turns into a programming code that is deleted. To Ross, friendly Kemi was not a human being with a mother and father. He was a security hole that must be plugged. This is the real horror of the dark web. It strips humanity from people and turns them into data. While Ross thought he was protecting his empire with the bodies of his enemies, he was actually sinking into quicksand. These orders were the original sin that made American security agencies, FBI and DEA, turn the case from drug trafficking into national security and terrorism. Agent Bob Terwilliger, who was monitoring the chats, described his feelings, saying, "We were seeing a monster being born before our eyes, someone who thinks he has the right to end human lives because he possesses Bitcoin and encryption."
The secrets that many did not know are that Ross began losing his mind due to these operations. He began to doubt everyone around him, even his closest assistants. He began writing in his diary mysterious words about necessary sacrifices for a better world. Silk Road turned from the utopia of freedom into the dystopia of blood. In the midst of this madness, Ross committed the fatal error. He began to trust the killers more than he trusted his software, and began leaving behind a digital paper trail that could not be erased. Chat logs, Bitcoin transfers linked to his primary wallet, and the passwords he used to confirm deaths. At the end of this paragraph, we leave Ross Ulbricht at the height of his delusional power. He thinks he killed his enemies and that he has become the godfather who is invincible. He thinks that the Silk Road is fortified with blood. But he doesn't know that the killers he paid were themselves weaving the shroud that would wrap around his neck. Innocence has completely fallen, and what remains is just a pirate drowning in a sea of blood-stained codes, waiting for the moment when the law will knock on his door, not to ask him about drugs, but to ask him about the bodies he paid for with the currency of freedom.
While Ross Ulbricht thought he was fighting a holy war for freedom against a state he saw as tyrannical, there were, on the other side of the barricade, demons of an entirely different kind. It is one of the strangest and most terrifying chapters in the history of American federal crime, where the battle was not between white and black or good and evil, but was a battle in a dark gray area, where the boundaries between cop and criminal were erased. In this paragraph, we will reveal how the agents tasked with bringing down Silk Road turned into thieves and blackmailers, and how they exploited the dark web to sink into a vice that was deeper than Ross's vice itself. There were two main teams chasing Ross, one in New York and another in Baltimore. In the Baltimore team, two names emerged that would remain a stain on the history of the DEA, Drug Enforcement Administration, and the Secret Service: Carl Force and Sean Bridges. These two men were not just investigators, they were tech experts who possessed the keys to access the heart of Silk Road. But instead of using these keys to close the gates of hell, they used them to plunder the digital treasures flowing through them.
Carl Force, the veteran DEA agent, was tasked with communicating with Dread Pirate Roberts, or DPR, under fake identities. Force assumed the character of a drug smuggler named Knob. Over time, Force was no longer playing the role of Knob, but became Knob. A devastating idea began to seep into his mind. Why do I work for a meager government salary when I can get millions with the press of a button? Force exploited Ross's blind trust in him and began blackmailing him. He contacted him with another identity called French Maid and claimed he possessed leaked information from the FBI about the investigations. Ross paid him $100,000 in Bitcoin for information that was actually official papers Force possessed by virtue of his job. The secrets that internal investigations later revealed were terrifying. Carl Force was playing a game of double deception. He was writing official reports to his superiors saying he had reached nothing, while in his private room and from behind an encrypted screen, he was laughing as he saw his Bitcoin wealth swell. He did not stop at blackmail. He sold information to private companies and even tried to intimidate Bitcoin sellers using his federal powers to steal their balances. The protector of the domain turned into a pirate, feeding on the crumbs of Ross's empire, exploiting the absence of oversight in the world of the dark web.
As for Sean Bridges, the Secret Service agent, he was the most cunning and dangerous technical mind. Bridges possessed administrative access to accounts inside Silk Road after arresting a minor employee. Instead of informing his superiors, he carried out a silent attack. In one night, he changed the passwords of hundreds of accounts for sellers and buyers and transferred everything in them of Bitcoin to his private wallets. Bridges stole what was worth $800,000 at that time, which multiplied in value later to reach tens of millions. The tragic irony is that Ross Ulbricht saw these corrupt agents, without knowing their real identities, as friends and advisors. He consulted Knob, Carl Force, on how to escape the FBI, and Force gave him real advice to prolong the game so he could steal more money. The chase was a bloody farce. The cat was helping the mouse to escape, so the mouse would continue bringing cheese. This corruption delayed Ross's arrest for several months and even made Ross increasingly confident that security agencies were stupid and failures, which made him commit less cautious errors in the end.
This part of the story reveals the moral contagion spread by the dark web. Easy money, anonymity, and the absence of material deterrence were all factors that lured even the men who swore to protect the Constitution. Bridges and Force believed that Bitcoin was a digital ghost that could not be tracked, just as Ross believed. They thought they were smarter than the system. But just as Ross fell because of an email thread, these agents fell because of the blockchain. Humans forget, but the blockchain records every movement forever. When the Integrity Unit in Washington discovered that massive amounts of Bitcoin disappeared from the evidence accounts, secret investigations began. The shock was that betrayal did not come from the outside, but from the heart of the operation. Silk Road money polluted everyone who approached it.
Agent Force ended up sentenced to 6 years in prison, while Bridges was sentenced to 8 years. Their story became a black lesson in security academies about how technology can corrupt the strongest souls.
For Ross Ulbricht, this corruption was the straw that broke the camel's back in his trial. His defense team tried to use the story of corrupt agents to say that the entire investigation was polluted and illegal, and that evidence had been manipulated. Although this did not prevent his conviction, it revealed to the world that Silk Road was not just a drug market, but was a laboratory of human evil, where everyone in it turned into monsters. The criminal asks for murder, the cop steals victims, and everyone dances to the tunes of encrypted Bitcoin. In this paragraph, we see that Silk Road was a mirror reflecting the ugliest in human nature. It is a story about the fall of principles before the lure of digital wealth. Ross was not the only one who lost his moral compass. He was surrounded by a world of wolves, some wearing pirate masks and some wearing federal badges. While the rogue agents were laundering their stolen money, honest investigators in New York were gathering the last pieces of the puzzle, away from the noise of betrayal, to reach the simple thread that would put an end to the dread pirate in a place he never expected, between bookshelves in a public library where no encryption protects him from the long arm of the law.
While Ross Ulbricht was drowning in megalomania, issuing assassination orders and thinking that the sacred engineering of darkness he built by integrating Tor and Bitcoin had made him an invisible god above the law, there was somewhere in New York, inside a dimly lit office full of piles of papers and bureaucratic files, a man who didn't look like movie heroes. Gary Alford was not an expert in the dark web, nor did he possess hacking programs belonging to the National Security Agency. Rather, he was an investigator in the U.S. Internal Revenue Service, BIRS. His only weapon was patience and the ability to read between the lines in the Internet archive that forgets nothing. In this paragraph, we will dive into the details of the most exciting digital criminal operation, where we will discover that the empire whose construction cost millions of dollars of encrypted codes fell because of a primitive error committed by an enthusiastic young man before he became the dread pirate. The story began when Gary Alford was tasked with joining the Joint Task Force to hunt the Silk Road. At that time, FBI and DEA agencies were immersed in trying to hack the site technically, and were looking for holes in the Tor system or trying to track Bitcoin wallets, but they were always hitting walls of impossible mathematical encryption. Gary, with his mind accustomed to tracking human lapses in tax evasion, decided to take an entirely different path. He asked himself a simple question. This site did not appear out of nowhere. Its owner must have promoted it in its beginnings when it was still unknown and when he was still committing errors.
Gary began a digital excavation operation in the depths of search engines, using advanced search techniques to go back in time to 2011, the moment Silk Road was born. He spent weeks reading thousands of posts in old forums like Bitcoin Talk and Shroomery. He was looking for the first mention of Silk Road. Suddenly, he found his prize. On January 27, 2011, a user carrying the pseudonym Altoid published a post in the Shroomery forum, a forum for lovers of hallucinogenic fungi, saying, "I found a great site called Silk Road. It's like Amazon for drugs. Here's the link." For any other investigator, this might look like just a user admiring the site, but Gary felt that this was the thread. He tracked Altoid and other forums and found that this user was promoting the site with the tone of a founder and not just a customer. After months of painstaking research, Gary found the fatal post. In the Bitcoin Talk forum, Altoid posted an advertisement asking for an expert programmer in the Bitcoin language to help him in a startup project and asked interested parties to email him. At that moment, time stopped for Gary Alford. Dread Pirate Roberts had committed the error that cannot be repaired. He used his personal email, which contains his real name, in a moment of haste or perhaps overconfidence in his beginnings. Gary did not believe his eyes, so he immediately searched for the name Ross Ulbricht in regular search engines. He found a profile on LinkedIn for a young man from Austin, Texas, describing himself as an investment analyst interested in libertarian economic models. He found videos of him on YouTube talking about absolute freedom and demolishing state idols. The intellectual match between Ross and DPR data on Silk Road was stunning. But Gary did not stop here. He contacted Google via a court order to obtain the data of this email. He discovered that Ross Ulbricht was logging into his email from IP addresses in San Francisco, specifically from an area called Glen Park. When Gary compared these times to the times when Dread Pirate Roberts was active on Silk Road, he found a 100% match. There was no doubt. The yoga-practicing physicist was himself the digital godfather who orders assassination operations.
The terrifying secrets that this stage of the investigation revealed are that Ross Ulbricht was living a literal double life. Gary was watching how Ross, under his pseudonym Josh, was renting a cheap room and spending his time in public libraries and cafes, while millions were flowing under his fingers. Ross thought that by disappearing into the crowd and using public Wi-Fi networks, he had cut all means of reaching him. He did not know that the original sin he committed in 2011 was chasing him like a shadow that doesn't disappear. When Gary Alford presented his results to FBI agents in New York, he was initially met with a kind of ridicule. Technical geniuses in the federal office did not believe that an obscure tax investigator had found the man they failed to track with their advanced devices. But numbers and data do not lie. A secret surveillance team was formed in San Francisco. Agents began tracking Ross at every step. They saw him leaving his apartment, buying coffee, and sitting in public libraries. They noticed that the moment he opens his laptop, DPR begins replying to messages in the dark web.
The tragic irony in Ross's life is that he was obsessed with digital security, but he neglected human security. He carried his laptop with him as if it were his spoiled child, and it contained everything: chat logs, his daily diaries, Bitcoin wallets, and even assassination orders. His laptop was his kingdom and also his guillotine. Gary Alford, through his simple Google search, had put the rope around Ross's neck, waiting for the moment when the FBI team would pull the platform from under his feet. The terrifying lesson in this paragraph is that the internet does not forget. Every comment, every email, every prophecy written by a teenager remains stored in company servers, waiting for a patient investigator to reassemble the pieces. Silk Road, which was supposed to be the pinnacle of technology, collapsed because of a technology dating back to 1996, email. Ross Ulbricht, who was challenging the powers of the great state, fell before a tax investigator who possessed only the time and the ability to search in the past.
At the end of this paragraph, we see the FBI weaving the threads of the final trap. The question was no longer who is DPR, but became how do we catch him while the laptop is open? This was the major dilemma, for if Ross felt danger and closed the laptop screen, the hard drive encryption would make it impossible for the government to obtain any evidence condemning him. They had to invent a play that makes him forget his security for a few seconds. While Gary Alford was watching from afar, history was preparing to record the moment when the digital godfather would turn into just prisoner number 001 in a solitary cell, to end the legend of Silk Road in a scene no less exciting than the greatest crime films in history.
The date was October 1st, 2013, and the time was approaching 3:15 p.m. in San Francisco. It was an ordinary day for the city's residents, but for the FBI and DEA teams, this was Judgment Day. In this paragraph, we will reveal the details of the security operation taught today in intelligence academies around the world, the operation that did not aim merely to catch a person, but aimed to kidnap an entire digital continent before it vanishes behind encryption walls. The challenge was, how do you catch Dread Pirate Roberts while the laptop is still in an active state? For if Ross closed the lids of his laptop for 1 second, the evidence would be lost forever behind the impossible AES-256 encryption walls.
The day began with close surveillance of Ross Ulbricht as he left his apartment, which he rented under the name Josh. Ross, with his usual paranoia, was looking around him, but he did not notice the undercover agents dressed as hikers and tourists. Ross headed to the Glen Park Public Library, a quiet library frequented by seniors and students. Ross chose a table on the top floor near the science fiction section and sat with his back to the wall, a position that ensured he could see everyone approaching him. He opened his Samsung 700Z laptop, connected to the library's free Wi-Fi, and dove into the depths of his kingdom. At that moment, Federal Agent Chris Tarbell and his team were monitoring data movement across the network from a car parked outside. They saw Dread Pirate Roberts logging into the main control panel for Silk Road. The catch was precious, the Emperor in his office, and the safes open. But the problem was in the auto-lock. Ross had programmed his laptop to wipe random access memory, RAM, and close encryption immediately if it sensed any strange movement or if the cover was closed. The agents had to invent a human distraction that breaches Ross's psychological defenses before the digital ones.
Here began the play. An FBI agent and an agentess entered the library pretending to be a couple in a violent shouting match. They began shouting and trading accusations directly behind Ross, 2 steps away from him. The shouting was loud enough to breach the library's strict silence. As expected from human nature, Ross turned in shock to see what was happening behind his back, and in those 3 seconds that he turned his face, Agent Tom Kiernan, who was sitting next to him pretending to read, jumped and snatched the laptop from above the table with lightning speed. At that moment, Ross tried to jump to retrieve his laptop, but handcuffs had already clamped on his wrists and he was pinned to the floor. Agent Kiernan shouted, "Laptop is open! I repeat, laptop is open!" These words were the music that prosecutors had waited for years. While Ross was lying on the library's dusty carpet, the fingers of technical investigators were working at crazy speed to prevent the laptop from entering sleep mode. They installed a motion simulator device in the USB slot to keep the screen active and immediately moved the device to a mobile forensic lab.
The secrets that investigators found inside that laptop in those first minutes were the goldmine they never dreamed of. Ross was not just a programmer, he was an obsessed archivist. They found a secret folder containing his daily diaries in which he wrote everything since 2010. He wrote about his anxiety, his ambition, and the moment he realized he had become Dread Pirate Roberts. They found a detailed Excel spreadsheet containing a list of all his employees, their salaries in Bitcoin, and their wallet addresses. Most terrifyingly, they found a folder titled Logbook, containing complete records of all the assassination operations he requested, with photos of the alleged bodies sent to him by the scammers. Investigators discovered that Ross was keeping a complete manifesto explaining how he would demolish the world system. He possessed a file containing a list of enemies of the empire who must be monitored. The biggest shock was in the main Bitcoin wallet open on the screen.
It contained more than 144,000 bitcoins. Today, their value exceeds billions. Ross was sitting on a mountain of digital gold, and in one moment, this mountain turned into evidence of a conviction that cannot be refuted.
Hidden secrets in his diaries revealed a shaky human side. He was writing about his feeling of absolute loneliness and how the mask had devoured his life. He wrote in one entry, "I made a monster, and now I cannot leave it. I am a prisoner in its kingdom as much as they are prisoners." These personal confessions were what destroyed his defense attempts later to portray him as merely an innocent programmer who created the site, then left it to others. The laptop proved he was the captain from the first day until the moment the handcuffs fell. As Ross was being led to the FBI car, he was looking in shock at the library, that quiet environment he chose to be his fortress and which became the stage for his end. The U.S. government proved on that day that it can face encryption genius with the simplicity of human deception. The Silk Road did not fall by a complex cyber attack, but fell by a play of a couple arguing. The terrifying lesson in this paragraph is in the illusion of digital security. Ross thought that his algorithms protect him, but he forgot that his body still exists in the physical world, subject to the laws of gravity, chance, and human error. Ross Ulbricht's fall in the Glen Park Library represents the end of the romantic piracy era and the beginning of the total surveillance era. The laptop that housed hundreds of millions of dollars, poisons, and blood became now a piece of scrap in the federal evidence storage, witnessing that the digital godfather is but a human of flesh and blood, whose will can be broken by a staged noise in a public place. At the end of this paragraph, we leave Ross facing the darkness in his first cell, while investigators begin analyzing terabytes of data that will reveal secrets no one imagined about the global Silk Road network. But was his arrest the end? Or had the monster he made already begun to clone itself in other places of the dark world? And how will Ross interact with the fact that his comrades and leaders of his empire are the first to stand against him in the courtroom? By January 2015, New York City was preparing for one of the most controversial trials in the 21st century. In courtroom number 15 in Manhattan, Ross Ulbricht was not facing merely drug trafficking charges. He was facing the prestige of the state, which he wounded to death. Ross stood before Judge Catherine Forrest, and he was no longer that dread pirate hiding behind a screen, but was a pale young man wearing a blue suit, surrounded by lawyers trying desperately to weave a narrative that saves him from the legal black hole waiting for him. In this paragraph, we will dive into the backstage of that trial and reveal the secrets told behind closed doors and how the judiciary platform turned into an arena for settling scores between the Bitcoin generation and the federal law generation. The trial began with a bold defense strategy put together by the famous lawyer Joshua Drattle. His narrative said that Ross Ulbricht is indeed the one who created Silk Road as a libertarian economic experiment, but he soon felt terror from the scale of the site and the control of criminals over it, so he handed over the keys to other people who were the ones who managed real criminal operations, and that the FBI had fallen into a trap set by the real godmother of the site, who implicated Ross at the last moment. But this defense began to collapse under the weight of the digital treasure found in Ross's open laptop. Prosecutors were reading excerpts from his daily diaries out loud before the jurors. "Today I bought a new stash. Today I issued an order to liquidate the traitor." The words were written in his digital handwriting, dated and organized in a way that leaves no room for doubt that he was the captain until the last second before arrest.
The most terrifying moment in the trial was not the display of drug bags, but was when the prosecution presented chat logs for assassination requests. Although Ross was not officially tried on the charge of murder in this case, because victims did not actually die, the judge allowed these evidences to be displayed to prove the character of the defendant. The jurors saw how Ross was negotiating the price of the head as if he were buying a piece of furniture. These evidences stripped Ross of the dreaming idealist attribute and showed him as a digital tyrant ready to sacrifice lives to protect his wealth.
Shock hung over the room every time a faked corpse photo was displayed, which Ross had received and expressed his relief at seeing it. But for the dramatic scene to be complete, the prosecution summoned victims of another kind, not traitors or killers, but fathers and mothers. The father of a teenager stood up, who died because of an overdose of a drug bought through Silk Road. The father looked Ross in the eyes and said with bitterness, "You made death available at the press of a button and made it easy for my child to commit suicide without me being able to save him." This moment shattered the philosophical narrative Ross was trying to promote. Drugs in Silk Road were not a libertarian act, but were a weapon that destroyed real families in the physical world.
In contrast, the defense team tried to highlight the government corruption we revealed in the previous paragraph. They talked about agents Carl Force and Sean Bridges and how they stole Bitcoin and blackmailed Ross. Lawyer Dreidel tried to convince the jurors that the investigation was polluted and that digital evidence can be easily manipulated by these rogue agents. But Judge Forrest was firm. She refused to allow many of these pleas, considering that agents' corruption is a separate case that does not cancel the conclusive evidence found in Ross's personal laptop. Ross felt that the ground was pulling out from under his feet and that the algorithms he used to hallow had turned into shackles that do not break. After short deliberations that did not exceed 3.5 hours, the jurors returned with the expected verdict: guilty on all 7 counts, including managing a continuing criminal enterprise, a law usually used against big mafia bosses. At that moment, absolute silence prevailed in the room. Ross looked at his family, and his features reflected a late realization that the game had ended tragically. But the biggest shock was not in the conviction, but was in the pronouncement of the sentence, which came several months later.
On the day of the verdict, May 29, 2015, Ross Ulbricht gave a final word in which he appealed to the judge's mercy. He said in a trembling voice, "I have realized that I committed a grave mistake. I have destroyed my life with my own hand. Please leave me a light at the end of the tunnel. Do not sentence me to death inside the prison. Allow me to see the sun again in my old age." It was the cry of a human who realized late that the absolute freedom he called for led him to absolute slavery behind bars. But Judge Catherine Forrest's response was historical and cold like a guillotine blade. She said to him, "Mr. Ulbricht, you are not just a programmer. You are a godfather to a global empire of crime. You thought you were smarter than the law and thought that encryption would protect you from moral responsibility, so that there is a deterrent to everyone who thinks of following in your footsteps, and so the world knows that the internet is not a forest without law. My sentence on you is life imprisonment twice, plus 40 years, without any possibility of parole."
This sentence was not just a punishment, it was civil execution. It means that Ross Ulbricht will leave prison in a coffin only. It was a sentence harsher than the sentences issued against serial killers or traditional drug traffickers. The U.S. government wanted to make Ross a digital lesson. They wanted to shatter the dread pirate legend in its cradle, so another genius programmer would not dare to challenge state's authority. Ross's supporters left the court screaming, "This is injustice," while Ross was being led in handcuffs to the prison bus to begin his journey towards more isolated and strict prisons. The secrets that remained kept were the psychological state of Ross after the verdict. It is said he spent weeks in a state of total daze, unable to grasp the idea that he would not touch a keyboard or see nature again. He turned from a digital god controlling the fates of millions to a number in the federal prison system. Silk Road, which he wanted to be a road for freedom, ended with him in a cell measuring 2 meters by 3 meters.
The terrifying lesson in this paragraph is in the collision of the two worlds. Ross thought that dark web laws could cancel physical reality laws, but he discovered that the state, when it feels threatened in the essence of its sovereignty, responds with ruthless oppression. The trial was not about drugs, it was about who owns the power. Is it the algorithm or the law? And on that day of 2015, the law proved that it still possesses the handcuffs, and that encryption, no matter how complex, cannot protect its owner's body from the jailer's grip. At the end of this paragraph, we leave Ross at the beginning of his eternity inside the prison, while his name turns into an icon and martyr in the eyes of dark web internet communities. But while Ross was languishing in his cell, the monster he made had already begun to metamorphose. The world learned a lesson from Ross's fall. Do not use Gmail and do not sit in public libraries. Instead of Silk Road disappearing, it exploded into hundreds of fragments that became more brutal and more complex, to begin a new stage of the cyber war that is still ongoing to this day.
In Greek myths, there is a monster called Hydra. Every time you cut off one head, 2 more brutal heads sprout in its place. This is exactly what happened the moment Silk Road servers were closed in 2013. Ross Ulbricht thought he was the only leader, but he did not realize that he did not build just a site, but put the blueprint for a new type of global crime that cannot be eradicated. In this paragraph, we will dive into the poisoned legacy Ross left behind and how the dark web after his imprisonment turned from a market for magic mushrooms into a terrifying catalog featuring the ugliest of what the human mind produced of evils, and how Ross's students learned from his fatal errors to become real ghosts that cannot be caught. A few weeks after Ross's arrest, the Silk Road 2.0 site appeared. The site was not just a simulation, but was a blatant challenge to the state. Its new manager wore the same mask, Dread Pirate Roberts. The message was clear: the pirate does not die, and the title is not imprisoned. The new manager, who later turned out to be a former programmer at SpaceX named Blake Benthel, learned harsh lessons from Ross's fall. No longer was Gmail used. No longer was there talk in public forums, and servers became scattered in countries that do not have extradition agreements with America. Although the FBI was able to close the second version too, the Pandora's box had already been opened, and what came out of it was never to be closed again.
The dark web exploded into hundreds of sites and competitors like Alphabay, Hansa, and Dream Market. These sites did not adhere to libertarian principles or the false ethics Ross was promoting. The philosophy of live and let live disappeared, replaced by the logic of absolute profit and total destruction. The catalog of death began to expand. It was no longer limited to marijuana, but the digital space began buzzing with Chinese pure fentanyl that kills thousands in microscopic doses, chemical weapons, and ransomware capable of stopping hospitals and entire states from working. Ross's dream of a free market turned into a global market for digital terrorism. The most terrifying secrets in this legacy lie in the technical evolution that followed Ross's fall. New pirates realized that Bitcoin was not entirely safe as Ross thought. Every transaction is recorded in the blockchain forever. So they moved to darker and more mysterious currencies like Monero, a currency that leaves no trace of the path of money. They also developed ghost server technologies that wipe themselves automatically upon sensing any hack attempt. The new generation of digital godfathers became more professional. They do not sit in public libraries, but manage their operations from inside technically fortified strongholds in countries like Russia, Ukraine, and Thailand, away from the FBI's grip.
But perhaps the strangest aspects of this legacy is the transformation of Ross Ulbricht himself into an icon and digital martyr. The Free Ross campaign was launched, collecting millions of signatures and supported by wealthy and prominent figures in the tech world. Ross turned from a convicted criminal into a symbol of grievance against state tyranny. This deification of Ross fed the spirit of rebellion among thousands of young programmers around the world who saw in his story a motivation to build more complex encryption systems in revenge for their imprisoned godfather. Ross, while behind bars, became the intellectual fuel for an ongoing cyber war where his followers see that federal law is the enemy and that encryption is the new religion. Hidden secrets in the dark side of this legacy revealed the emergence of services that did not exist in Ross's time, such as laundering as a service, where traditional criminals, human traffickers, the Italian mafia, Mexican cartels, can turn their dirty money into clean digital assets via dark web markets that took their business model from Silk Road. Ross unintentionally linked classic organized crime with programming genius to create a terrifying hybrid called cyber mafia.
In 2017, international authorities tried to deliver a knockout blow to this legacy via Operation Bayonet. In this operation, the FBI, in cooperation with the Dutch police, carried out a stunning intelligence trick,
They took control of the Hansa site secretly and left it working for a whole month while they were gathering data of every seller and buyer who fled to it after the closure of Alpha Bay. The shock was that the volume of trade had doubled tens of times from what it was in Ross's time. They discovered that Silk Road was only the small peak of a giant iceberg extending in the depths of the digital ocean. The poisoned legacy even reached international relations. Countries became using the dark web and its markets to fund their secret operations or to bypass economic sanctions, using the same technologies Ross Ulbricht put in his room. Bitcoin, which Ross saw as a tool for freedom, turned into a means of funding wars and cyber attacks across borders. The boy who wanted to be Robin Hood ended up opening the doors for all the demons of the earth to enter our homes via internet wires.
The terrifying lesson in this paragraph is that the idea is stronger than the prison. Ross Ulbricht's body is shackled in handcuffs, but his idea roams the world in thousands of copies. Silk Road proved that old geographical laws are no longer sufficient to protect societies. We live today in a post-Silk Road world, a world where the boundaries between crime and technology have vanished, where a teenager in his bedroom can cause destruction exceeding what regular armies cause. The legacy Ross left is absolute uncertainty, for we never know who the next Dread Pirate Roberts is, and we do not know when the next pirate will decide that the price of digital freedom is human lives in the real world. At the end of this paragraph, we see that Silk Road was not just a chapter in the history of crime, but was the Big Bang that created a dark parallel universe we all live in now. While Ross languishes in his cell monitoring news of sites falling one after another, he knows in his heart that he is the spiritual father of all this ruin. But what about Ross the human? And what about the investigator who is still chasing the truth? In the next and final paragraph, we will face the most important question. Did the state really win? Or did Ross Ulbricht achieve his goal in the end, but in a way that made the world a more terrifying place than he imagined?
While you read these words now, and at this very moment, Ross Ulbricht languishes behind the walls of the high-security federal Tucson prison in Arizona. No longer are there screens, no encryption, no Bitcoin, no pirate masks. There is only the deadly stillness of the desert, the smell of cheap detergents, and the countdown for days that will not end except with death. In this concluding paragraph, we will dive into the current state of the dark web godfather, analyze the legal and ethical conflict that still tears global public opinion, and face the terrifying truth. Did the state succeed in burying Ross Ulbricht, or did it turn him into a spirit inhabiting every encryption algorithm we use today? Ross Ulbricht's day begins at 5 in the morning. He wakes up in a cramped cell, wearing the cotton prison suit, spending his time reading, writing, and practicing yoga, trying to maintain what's left of his mind that once weighed stars and atoms. Secrets coming out of his leaked letters from prison reveal a man undergoing a stage of psychological purification. He no longer talks about revolution or demolishing the state. Instead, he talks about the value of the human touch, and about his deep regret for the souls lost because of the poisons he facilitated selling. He wrote in one of his letters with bitterness, "I thought I was liberating the world, but I discovered I was building a bigger prison for myself and others." This transformation from divine vanity to human brokenness is the real tragedy in Ross's story.
On the other side of the bars, one of the fiercest human rights battles in modern history is taking place. His mother, Lynn Ulbricht, leads the Free Ross campaign, which has turned into an international organization. Lynn is no longer just a mother. She has become the voice of conscience, asking the world, does a young man who committed a non-violent crime with his hand and created a website deserve to spend the rest of his life in the grave, while real killers and human traffickers get out after a few years? The campaign collected more than 6 million signatures and received support from figures like Elon Musk, Jack Dorsey, Twitter founder, and many libertarian thought leaders. The conflict here is not about Ross's innocence, for they all admit he erred, but the conflict is on the justice of the punishment. Sentencing him to life twice without the possibility of release is in the eyes of many a political revenge and not judicial justice. Hidden secrets in this legal conflict lie in the double standards applied by the U.S. government.
While Ross languishes in prison forever, we find that the corrupt agents, Force and Bridges, who stole millions and blackmailed Ross, have already gotten out of prison after serving short sentences. Even the big drug dealers on Silk Road who testified against Ross received very reduced sentences and returned to practice their lives. This legal gap is what made Ross a digital martyr in the eyes of an entire generation of programmers. Ross's case became the thermometer, measuring the extent of traditional systems' fear of technology. The state did not punish Ross for drugs, but punished him for the innovation that cannot be controlled.
The terrifying lesson lies in the bitter reality we live in today. Ross Ulbricht fell, but the Silk Road doctrine won. Look around you. Bitcoin, which was a tool in Ross's basement, became today part of the investment portfolios of states and major companies. Encryption, which was viewed as a criminal act, became today the backbone for all our communications on WhatsApp and Signal. The privacy Ross fought for, in his wrong way, became the first demand for humanity in the era of total surveillance. In a surreal and dark way, Ross achieved his goal. He forced the world to recognize digital sovereignty, but the price was his life and the lives of his victims. The philosophical conclusion of this epic puts us before an ugly mirror. We live now in a big Silk Road, where data is the currency, encryption is the shield, and big tech companies own a power exceeding states' power, exactly as Dread Pirate Roberts dreamed. The boundaries between the clear web and the dark web have vanished. Every phone in our pocket is a hole, and every programming code is a potential weapon. Ross Ulbricht was the harbinger who warned us or heralded us of this world, but he fell because he did not understand that technology without ethics is merely a guillotine waiting for its owner.
In the final moments of this file, we must wonder, did the investigator really win? The government closed the site, imprisoned the man, and confiscated the money. But did the world become safer? Statistics say that digital drug trafficking has multiplied thousands of times since Ross's fall. Hitmen in the dark web became more professional. Intelligence corruption became more cunning. It seems that Silk Road was not the problem, but was the symptom for a deeper disease in the body of modern civilization, the disease of searching for escape from state authority at any price, even if the price is throwing oneself in the arms of the digital devil. Ross Ulbricht will remain in his cell, watching the moon from behind the bars, realizing that he is the man who started a fire he could not put out. His story will remain an eternal reminder that truth is always stranger than fiction, and that programming codes may build empires, but human errors are what demolish them. Ross was the physicist of mass destruction who made the Bitcoin bomb, and now he lives in the aftermath of its silent explosion.
As the investigator, I have spent hours with you analyzing this secret file. We dove into the depths of encryption, heard the victim's screams, and saw the glint of digital gold. But the truth I extracted is that Silk Road is not a website, but a human tendency towards the forbidden. Ross Ulbricht did not create anything new. He gave a digital face to ancient desires as old as humanity. And now, with the closure of this file, the question remains addressed to you. Do you believe that Ross Ulbricht is the Prometheus of the digital age, who was imprisoned because he brought the fire of encryption to humans? Or is he merely an Al Capone wearing a programmer's mask? And do you believe that his staying in prison forever is justice? Or is it the biggest crime committed by the state against technology? Share your views with us in the comments, for you are now part of this investigation. And do not forget, in the digital world, nothing disappears forever, and every footprint you leave might be the thread that will lead the next investigator to you. I am the investigator. Thank you for following this long and deep file. Click the subscribe button and activate the bell to be the first to open with us the coming files that government eyes hide. I'll see you in the next file, where truth lies in the shadows.